Welcome to India Hangout Concepts, where we try and look at issues and try and explain what they mean to you and to, of course, everyone who might be watching this later. So the question that we're asking today is Syria's refugees, whose problem are they really? So we're joined by two people. One is Professor Jan Semmelroggen from the Nottingham Trent University, who's written on this subject a fair bit. We're also going to be joined by Vaiju, Naravane, an international affairs commentator, and try and get the India angle in. So thank you both for joining us. So Jan, let me begin with you and ask the first question. So why has this situation, that's the Syrian refugee situation, worsened to the extent that we are seeing it in a manner that's been splashed across headlines all over the world?
Well, this refugee crisis didn't come out of nowhere. It has been building up for the last decade. It probably started already 10 years ago. We've seen the first boats arrive in places like Greece, southern Italy. It is just in the last few years, with the geopolitical changes in North Africa, in Libya, and Tunisia, that this problem has exponentially grown. Adding to that is the civil war in Syria, the situation in Iraq, the situation in Afghanistan. So what we have right now is a perfect storm. Essentially, we have no functioning government in North Africa, like any partners that the European countries could work with to control or manage the migration flow into Europe. At the same time, the war in Syria is gradually spiraling out of control. More and more people are leaving. And the fact is that Europe is the closest safe haven for many of these refugees.
Right. So if I can understand this, you're saying that this has been gathering pace for a while now, but something has obviously got triggered. So are we seeing these headlines more because of people either getting dying in trucks where they're trying to cross over to Europe, or on boats which are sinking? Is it that, or is that the sort of key trigger that is maybe causing more, has brought more global attention at this point?
Yes, of course. The events of the last few days, with the young boy drowning off the coast of Turkey, obviously has raised some global attention. People in Canada, in New Zealand, and Australia are suddenly paying attention to this. But the fact is that countries like Greece and Italy, they've been dealing with this for the last 2-3 years, with like the mass arrivals of refugees on their shores. And these countries are already struggling as it is economically. So adding this humanitarian disaster to it exacerbates the problem. Now the problem, or the issue, the humanitarian crisis, is gradually moving north. Like 2-3 years ago, it was confined to the periphery of Europe. So, down south in Greece, in Italy. Now it is reaching Central Europe. If you go today to Vienna, you go to Munich, you see the refugees arriving, on a daily basis. So people, can't really ignore this topic anymore. It has arrived in the middle of Europe. We've seen the images this summer from Calais, with the refugees trying to jump lorries to get to Britain. Now the situation in Calais, for example, has been ongoing for the last 10 years. It's just gradually reaching a point now where ordinary people can't ignore it anymore. When you have 4,000 people living in abysmal conditions in the heart of Europe, this is becoming an issue. Right. And at the same time, this problem is not going away. What we're seeing right now is the tip of the iceberg. It's going to get worse next year, and it's going to get worse the year afterwards, because the push factors behind migration to Europe, global inequality, poverty in Africa, in the Middle East, wars, state persecution, these push factors still remain. So until anything gets done about that, I can't see any changes to the current migration crisis anytime soon.
Right. So, like I said, this is more. This is about concepts. We're trying to understand why things are as they are. And the next question really is it just Syria or other countries as well, which in some ways are the source of refugees at the scale that we are seeing? Jan, let me come back to you on that. So you did mention about some other countries, but take us through the larger problem. So Syria, of course, has seen the maximum outflow of, half of its citizenry as we understand, but other countries are also contributing to the stream of refugees, aren't they?
Through me?
Yes, Jan, that's for you.
Okay, I didn't quite get the question. I'm sorry, the connection is not the greatest right now.
Right. So the question, Jan, was: you did mention you did sort of refer to it earlier, but are there other countries which are also contributing to the stream of refugees that we are seeing, and how bad is it? Though we, of course, are focused more on Syria.
Yes, it is not the Syrian crisis by itself. The Syrians probably constitute the largest group within the migrant movement right now. At the same time, we have large refugee groups from Iraq, from Afghanistan, from Eritrea. So countries where there's either civil unrest or we have a dictatorial government that's almost forcing people to leave. At the same time, you will find virtually all nationalities right now in this migrant stream. So Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nigeria. Basically, we have a global migration from Asia and Africa towards Europe, and it's not just civil war and civil unrest that forces people to do, but it's also poverty. And again, this is something that's been ongoing for the last 30, 40 years. It is just these days in our global age that we live in, that people can maybe easier move from Asia and Africa into Europe, especially considering that we have organized human smugglers now filling the void that the restrictive European immigration policies have effectively created.
Right, and Jan, you did write in your CNN article that over 300,000 people have crossed, or refugees have crossed the Mediterranean into Europe, and of which about 2,500 have lost their lives in the last year. Vaiju, let me come to you. This is India Hangout Concepts, where we are trying to understand what really lies at the base of all of this. The question that we were asking is it really Syria or other countries that are also providing to the stream of refugees, and how do you see it from the India vantage point, if I may ask you?
Well, I've been covering the refugee crises, and I've visited places like Lampedusa immediately after the shipwreck, the big shipwreck where over 300 people lost their lives. And it's an incredible human tragedy that is playing out. As far as the Indian perspective is concerned, India has always been reluctant to any suggestion that it become part of the Western coalition that invaded Iraq or then, started this thing against Bashar al-Assad. It has always resisted any attempt to get it into the let's say the military action, whether it was in Libya, whether it was in Syria, or whether it was in Iraq. So the Indian position is, in a sense, we told you were not going to be able to pull this off. And there were many people in India who were saying that India should take a more proactive stand and should go with the West as far as Syria is concerned. It now turns out that the wiser lot in the Ministry of External Affairs were probably right. And what is really surprising is the resistance by people like Cameroon or Hungary or other places, which were willing partners in this coalition, which has actually led to the massive exodus that we are now seeing from Syria, Iraq, etc.
Right. So, which obviously brings me to my next question that we're asking here, which is that which countries should be absorbing these refugees, or rather, on whom does the onus of absorbing these refugees really fall? And obviously, we are seeing strains because different countries are responding differently, even within the European Union, and there is no clear policy for this. So, Jan, let's begin with you on this one.
So, in regards to the refugee crisis, it's only recently that Central European countries such as Germany and Austria have actually opened their doors. And it's really because they had no other choice. As I mentioned earlier, the refugee crisis was for the longest time contained in Greece and Italy, and now it's moving further north. So basically, when Angela Merkel last week announced that all Syrian refugees will be granted asylum in Germany, she was essentially acknowledging reality. These people have to go somewhere. All European countries have signed the 1951 UN Declaration on the Status of Refugees, thus granting any person fleeing war and persecution asylum. So what is happening now in Europe is that we have an unequal distribution or unequal sharing of the burden in regards to the migrants. So it's right now it's 5 countries that almost have to accommodate 3/4 of the refugees. We got Greece and Italy, obviously. Now we have Austria, Germany, and Sweden. So right now, what's happening at EU level is trying to find a quota or a distribution mechanism, whereas the refugees will get dispersed across the 28 member states of the EU, right. Just to share the burden around a little bit. And there's a lot of resistance to that. Cameron is resisting this, and particularly the Eastern Europeans are really resisting any attempt by the EU to enforce some sort of a quota. A number of heads of states in Eastern Europe have come out and openly said that they will not accept any Muslim refugees. They only want to have Christian refugees.
Right.
So,
right. So, Vaiju, let me come to you. One logical question which has been cropping up again and again is, why is the rest of the Middle East not being proactive in absorbing some of these refugees, and why is it only a Europe problem, at least the way it appears from where we are right now?
No, I disagree, if I may just interrupt. It is not simply a European problem. I think this has to become an international problem. I don't understand why the United States doesn't appear to be concerned by what's going on, because after all, the US was very much at the bottom of creating all these crises. The second thing I'd like to point out is that countries like Lebanon, which have taken up to 25% of their own population in terms of refugee intake. You have countries like Jordan. So it's not as if all the Middle Eastern countries are not involved, but effectively Saudi Arabia, which is one of the countries which has been exporting Wahhabi Islam and now has this major problem of ISIS on its door, is not doing anything to take the other refugees in. That's one issue. And I think this question cannot be resolved only at the European level. There has to be greater international consultations on trying to resolve this issue. Why is the US just sitting pretty and staying out of this question altogether? It's true that the refugees are heading towards Europe because it is territorially and geographically close to where they are. But it doesn't really mean at all that the Americans should take a back seat and pretend that this is not their problem at all.
Right. So, Vaiju, you did refer to this earlier, but so the next question is therefore, do you see a role for India at all in this situation?
Well, actually, I have a feeling that there should be an international conference. I'm not sure that India can take very much. During the Afghan crisis, there were a lot of Afghan refugees who came to India. And there were lots of Afghans, including Hamid Karzai and people like that, who went to university in New Delhi. So we have had waves of refugees. We have had 10 million refugees coming from Bangladesh into India during the 1971 crisis. But in this particular case, I think none of the refugees also want to go towards India. And I think perhaps we could have international consultations about which parts of the globe can actually take these refugees. But there is also the question of whose responsibility, it should be in the larger business of things. Because who was at the bottom of this crisis?
Right. Jan, so how do you see this being resolved? I mean, the question of being the immediate question of, taking charge of these large bulk of refugees, would there need to be more international consultations? Of course, they're happening already, not to say that they're not, but perhaps with a different approach, perhaps with more countries being brought together. How do you see this going?
Well, in the immediate short term, right now, what we need is a humanitarian response. Winter is coming in Europe pretty soon. We got people living in tents in Austria, in Germany. People are traveling over the Balkans, across the Mediterranean. So immediate humanitarian aid needs to provide to these migrants. That is the short-term solution. That's something where the Europeans have to come together, because right now it's their problem. Now, I agree, in the midterm, we need to have some sort of international response to this crisis. The death of the young boy off the coast of Turkey 2 days ago has actually created some sort of international awareness. I've seen the news from New Zealand, from Australia, from Canada, where people are suddenly waking up to this, that, realizing this is a global crisis, and there's debates in these countries now that, what can we do? So in the midterm, yes, there needs to be a global distribution of the refugees, but also something needs to be done for those refugees still sitting in Turkey, still sitting in Lebanon. As you mentioned, yes, a small country like Lebanon has taken in huge amounts of refugees. And these refugees right now, they're not seeing, they're realizing now that the Syrian crisis is not ending anytime soon. Syria right now, the way it's going, it might end up as a failed state, just like Afghanistan. So the migrants right now, the Syrian refugees sitting in Turkey, sitting in Lebanon, that are maybe waiting out for things to calm down in Syria, they will sooner or later realize it's not happening, and they will also make their way to Europe, and then we will really have a crisis. So something needs to be done to accommodate those refugees in those Middle Eastern countries. And I agree that countries like Saudi Arabia, like Dubai, Qatar, that they at least financially need to contribute something towards the refugee crisis. I think right now the Muslim world is actually seeing that, these are Muslim people that are persecuted, they're fleeing from their own government, from religious fundamentalists, and it's the Europeans right now that are providing shelter. It's not their fellow like Arab brethren in Saudi Arabia or in the Arabian Peninsula, with the exception, of course, of Lebanon maybe.
Right.
But in the long-term response, we need to address the inequalities that exist on a global scale, the poverty, the lack of opportunities in many global South countries, as well as the fact that much of the Middle East is just badly governed. We got poor leadership, whether it's the Assads in Syria or it's the leadership in Saudi Arabia, North Africa. The lack of democracy, the lack of liberties is also a major push factor why people are moving to Europe. Why are these migrants not moving to Saudi Arabia? Well, you look at Saudi Arabia's human rights record. Of course, the Syrian refugees or refugees from Iraq, from Eritrea will choose Europe because this is where they were granted, basic human rights.
Right. Okay, so let's come to the last question that we are posing today, which is really, what's the future for war refugees such as this, considering that it's become a big problem, and it's quite likely, as Jan pointed out earlier as well, it's not going to go away. It could actually become worse. So, Vaiju, let me start with you on that one.
Yes, I think we are heading for major crises even within Europe. If you take a look at what has happened in Europe post the financial crisis, with a kind of breakdown in the trust factor that people place in their governments, you have seen the rise of the extreme right, whether it's in Germany, whether it's in France with the Front National, whether it's in Britain with UKIP. There is a very, very strong anti-immigrant feeling that is growing. And in Britain, it's not just the feeling against the Syrians and other non-European refugees, but it's also against legal migrants from other European zones who are moving into Europe, and even they are not wanted. So this is going to exacerbate feelings of us and them. I'm not sure the refugees are going to have a particularly easy ride. And you can tell that from the way Mr. Cameron is caught in a cleft stick. There is so much pressure on him now to come out and say something about the refugees and say that we are going to take many more thousands. But at the same time, you have people like Nigel Farage and others who will put the pressure on him and will say that, look, this is going to cause problems within Britain. And the same thing is going to happen in Germany. There have already been several violent incidents in Germany. It's going to happen in France, where there have been violent incidents too. So I don't see how this refugee crisis is going to be resolved amicably and easily in the next decade.
Right. Thanks for that, Vaiju. Jan, last word. You also talked about, like a green card system for migrants. I think, but you've also in other articles distinguished between migrants, economic migrants, refugees, and those who are obviously dispossessed and forced to move from places where there is either war or some other strife. So, what's the future to you looking like? I mean, where could this head?
What I think in response to the current crisis, or the current, I don't want to call it a crisis, call it a challenge. The migrant crisis or the migrant challenge right now, it's going to bring out the worst elements in Europe, like the far right, xenophobic, nationalistic, but it also will bring out the best in people. Like we see across the continent right now, where governments are failing to provide support to the migrants. It's places like Hungary. It is civil society stepping up. It's volunteers helping. It's people opening their houses, people donating clothing. So this current situation it's two extremes. It brings out the best, it brings out the worst in people. And in order to prevail, what we need in Europe, we need strong leaders that will actually side with those people that are trying to do their best, and not be cowards and succumb to the temptation of catering to the far right xenophobic nationalists. So I think last week Mrs. Merkel took a very bold step in condemning any sort of nationalist xenophobic movements in Germany, whereas David Cameron right now is somewhat sitting on the fence, not really wanting to weigh in on this discussion. We look at the government in Hungary that is, really catering to the right wing, not providing any support to the migrants. And on the final note, what I would like to add, a lot of commentators are currently talking about this as being the worst refugee crisis since the Second World War, and that is true. My grandmother, who grew up in Germany, lived through that time. And in 1945, European continent was in ruins. The economy was in ruins. There were tens of millions of displaced people. But our forefathers, managed to pull together and actually, got through this crisis. And we had 50 years of economic prosperity. So I think that, our generation right now, we should also be able to rise to this challenge and, handle this crisis in a responsible and sustainable manner.
Right, Jan, thank you for sharing that with us. And we've run out of time. We've posed the basic questions about the Syrian refugees. Whose problem are they? Trying to understand what are the larger issues that that lie behind this crisis as we're seeing today, and more importantly, could it get worse? And finally, is the world or the nations of this world prepared to address this jointly, as opposed to clearly bumping it off to someone else? So that's the issue here. We run out of time. Thank you so much for joining us on India Hangout Concepts. We'll be back soon. Thanks for watching.